Thank you, Kaylee. Thank you very much. I'm just delighted to be able to participate in this new event, really, at the San Jacinto Monument. Boy, it doesn't get any better than being at the San Jacinto Monument doing a program on San Jacinto weekend. I'm just thrilled to get to do this. This new lecture series is fostered by the San Jacinto Museum and Battlefield Association, but also, I can tell you, it really was getting cranked up about a year ago by the San Jacinto Museum Foundation Board and by enthusiastic members of the Sons of the Republic of Texas who are all over the place out there. Special thanks are owed to Kaylee. Kaylee Ellis, you heard, is director of the Museum and Battlefield Association. She was of constant help with every need and problem that I had, and I know I had a lot of them. So anyway, thank you, Kaylee, for everything you've done. She is the soul of efficiency. And thank you all for being here. We heard all the forecasts about rain and stuff, and I'm glad it's held off. During my tenure as state historian, I did write a biography of Sam Houston, it's called Sam Houston, A Study in Leadership. That was the subject that really fascinated me about him. And my late wife really got into this, and she went online and she got me a Sam Houston tie. And I thought some of you would appreciate that. I should have worn it, I guess. Sam enlisted in the U.S. Army when he was 20 years old, and his mother signed for him, had to be 21. She signed for him, and she gave him a ring. It is a simple gold band, and you know of it, and it's got the word honor inscribed on the inside. And in fact, the Sam Houston Memorial Museum still has it and displays it from time to time. And so she got me one of these, and I always wear it when I do a Houston program or San Jacinto. And Kayla, would you mind? We're going to show you a flag. If you don't mind, we'll just hold it up. And this is a facsimile. There's something else Karen got online, and it is a facsimile of the Liberty flag that was carried by Colonel Sherman and his regiment. He came from Kentucky. I'll talk about him in a minute. And the original stands in the speaker's area at the state capitol, but it was discolored way back. And this one, at least it's not discolored. And so, the original is larger than this, but I thought you might like to see that because it served perhaps as the only battle flag that we had at that time. And then, let's see, okay, I guess that's all the toys I've brought. Some of you have seen me do programs before, and it just kills me not to come up without a couple of guns of some sort. But anyway, no flintlocks today or anything. 188 years ago, in 1836, Texas was torn by drama and by desperation, by conflict and violence. At the center of all this turbulence was a controversial but enormously gifted leader, and that was Major General Sam Houston. A word about what was going on at that time. There had been 5 months of conflict between Norteamericanos and Mexican soldados. There was the come and take it scrap at Gonzales, which kicked things off kind of in October of 1835. There was the grass fight near Mission Concepcion led by Jim Bowie. A 5-day battle at San Antonio led by Ben Milam, who was killed approaching a house, but we prevailed and won the city. There were several clashes in South Texas in and around Refugio, and then of course the siege of the Alamo began in February of 1836 when General Santa Anna and a large army showed up there. After all of that and more, 59 delegates met at a convention at Washington on the Brazos and signed the Texas Declaration of Independence on March 2, 1836. By a delicious historical coincidence, March 2, 1836, was the 43rd birthday of Sam Houston, who was the most prominent Norte Americano in Texas. He'd already been governor of a state. He'd served twice as a congressman, and he was a war hero when he was a young man. Houston was appointed Major General, second time he had had that appointment. He was a two-star general and commander of all Texian forces. So, with a small detail, General Houston rode toward the front, specifically toward Gonzales, where volunteers were gathering to go to the relief of the Alamo. So, 42 days after the Battle of San Jacinto, on March 11, 1836, Major General Houston rode into the log cabin village of Gonzales, which is only 65 miles or so from San Antonio, but it was the last sort of Anglo outpost. Camping beside the Guadalupe River at Gonzales were 374 men who had intentions of marching to reinforce the Alamo, but they needed some leadership. The day before Houston's arrival, they had elected as Colonel Edward Burleson, who was a veteran military guy, but he mostly dealt in Indian fights, although he had been San Antonio. Elected Lieutenant Colonel was Sidney Sherman, who recently arrived in Texas with a company of men, 52 men, I believe it was, and he had equipped those men by himself. He sold one of his businesses in Kentucky in order to equip those men. And the ladies of the community gave him a flag. They put a flag together, and it's the one that Kaylee and I just displayed for you. General Houston immediately added organization to this, what they called them, 1st Regiment of Texas Volunteers. But before the end of his first day in Gonzales, word came that the Alamo had fallen and every man in the garrison was slain. Well, virtually every household in that log cabin village had lost a father or son, a husband or a brother. And that night, as you can imagine, was filled with heart-stricken wailing. Houston sent out scouts, Deaf Smith and Henry Carnes. And on the 13th, Smith returned with Susanna Dickinson and her infant daughter. You'll recall that Susanna's husband was an artillery expert, and he was killed almost in front of her eyes at the Alamo. Susanna passed along word from Santa Ana that he was marching eastward to bring the fight into Anglo, Texas. General Houston promptly ordered his men to pack up for a night march. He intended to put space between his untrained, ragtag force and the vastly larger Mexican army, turning over 3 of his 4 supply wagons. That's all he had, was 4 supply wagons. And that's what he carried his cannon in. He had 2 cannons, did not have any gun trains or draft animals. And what are you going to do? He just turned over 3/4 of his supply wagons. So he dumped those cannons in the Guadalupe River. And then he pushed his men in a 10-mile night march before a brief halt. Gonzales non-combatants, seeing the army move out, boy, they scrambled around, gathered what possessions and provisions they could carry, and tried to keep up with the army. As everyone vacated the little town, the log structures were set ablaze. It was the start of the runaway scrape. As word spread of Santana's advance and of Houston's retreat, hundreds and then thousands of Texas settlers abandoned their homes. Throngs of refugees clogged the muddy trails that pass for roads in Texas. We didn't have any bridges, no infrastructure. There were unusually heavy rains throughout that spring of 1836. Waterlogged trails not only were muddy, there were stretches where water was ankle deep, even knee deep. Rivers and creeks were swollen. Refugee bands could be followed by trails of discarded possessions, underfed, with bad drinking water and little or no shelter. Refugees suffered illness and death, particularly youngsters. The night that General Houston marched out of Gonzales, 20 men deserted. That got him down to about 350 guys. While others complained that they'd stick with them, but they complained that they'd come to fight, not run. But Houston knew that his few hundred poorly armed, untrained men could not battle a Mexican army of thousands. He conducted a strategic retreat eastward into the heart of Anglo, Texas. And he was moving toward his supply base and his manpower base. At the same time, Mexican supply lines were stretched to perilous lengths because they were getting farther and farther from Mexico. Houston adopted a scorched earth policy, luring the Mexican army deep into an unfriendly region where Santa Anna could not supply his men. Gonzales was not the only village torched. Plantations were burned also, and even San Felipe, the capital of Stephen F. Austin's colony. Santa Anna divided his army first into 3 columns, and then Santa Anna broke off a 4th column. And then he broke off another one of 700 and some odd men to lead himself as a pursuit force. Ultimately, there were 5 columns. And the idea was that with that many columns probing around, they had a better chance of finding Houston's army and of outflanking it. Because if one column finds them, well, they can send out couriers and another column can come up and hopefully attack from the flank. And then also each column had a better chance of finding adequate provisions. But of course, Santa Anna's divided force gave Houston's much smaller army a better chance, at least against one of the columns. As he marched eastward, General Houston expected his army to expand greatly by volunteers, and he sent orders to Colonel James Fannin to withdraw his force of 400 men from Goliad and link up with Houston's army. But during the runaway scrape, word came that the indecisive Fannin was a West Point dropout, as you may know. He made it his first year and then dropped out pretty early in his second year. He got himself surrounded, and then he had to surrender his command. Unconditional surrender, incidentally. And on Palm Sunday, March 27th, that's 21 days to the day, 3 weeks to the day, after the massacre at the Alamo, Fannin and his men were marched out and executed, their bodies burned by order of Santa Anna. So now Houston's army was the only hope of the fledgling Republic of Texas. But he was right in his hope of patriotic volunteers. Soon after leaving Gonzales, about 150 men, not in a group, but in multiple groups, but they got to him just about the same time, and they joined up. And even though he had lost 20 deserters early on, now he was up to 500 men, and the word was that hundreds more were on the way. Now, a word about Houston. At 6'2" and 240 pounds, that's what his passport read. Houston was a giant among men born, think about it, 2 centuries ago. We're just smaller. A lot of us are old enough to remember. I mean, I was a guard in high school. Well, I did not even make the team today, but did back then. It was a couple of generations back. And I'll tell you, sheer physical size is a great asset for combat leaders. The greatest military leader of the early Middle Ages was Charlemagne, and he was said to be 7 feet tall. Well, when they finally found his tomb, he was 6'6", only 6'6". But the average knight in the early Middle Ages was 5'4", which meant some of them were 5'6", 5'8", something like that. But it also meant that some of them were 5'2" or 5'1", and they're looking up at this guy at 6'6". He looked 7 feet tall. Houston at 6'6". Do you remember the fine little, I've got a copy of the children's book, 6'6", Sam Houston. He might have been 6'2" or so, but he looked like he was 6'6". George Washington, a man of the 1700s. He was physically impressive at 6'3", and he had remarkable muscular strength, which he liked to show off. Now, Houston, during this campaign, he fashioned his hat into a Revolutionary War tricorn. You may or may not know, but his father, Major Sam Houston, his father, as a junior combat officer, fought under Daniel Morgan during the Revolution. And then he stuck with the military as a militia officer, and that's how he got to be a major. We had to have that militia in those days because we didn't have much of a standing army. We just didn't have anything much. And so it was important. And he went around faithfully to those drills. And little Sam, who was the middle child, there were 9 kids born and he was number 5. And little Sam went around with him and he marched on the weekend drill, marched with the big guys and everything. And unfortunately, Major Houston died when Sam was only 13. But Elizabeth, his mother, she was a large and formidable woman. She led an already planned move to land that had been purchased in Tennessee. The trek in 3 wagons across mountain trails, that was the great adventure of young Sam's boyhood. But he had no interest, once they got there, He had no interest in helping to hack a new family farm out of the wilderness, and a family store also was a turnoff to him. He was kind of like Abraham Lincoln in that regard. When pressured to get to work by his two older brothers and mother, 15-year-old Sam ran away 100 miles, crossed the Tennessee River, and settled in with a Cherokee tribe and stayed with them for about 3 years. The chief adopted him, kind of a father figure, I think, and gave Sam a name which meant the Raven. And after a few years, Sam returned home and began teaching in the cabin school. Houston turned 20 in March 1813. The War of 1812 had been going on for several months. It was at that point that a recruiting detail visited their community. Sam picked a silver dollar off the drumhead, signifying his willingness to enlist, but a recruit in the regular army had to be 21, so his mother had to sign for him, and I've already told, about her giving him the honor ring and so forth. I must say, he wore that ring, he was 20, and so he wore that ring 50 more years. He died at the age of 70 in Huntsville. And when he died, his wife, Margaret, slipped off that ring so that she could pass it around, and each child, they had 8 children, and all of them were there, and each child could see it. Well, anyway, he enlisted as a private. But here he was, this big strapping guy that knew drill and was a professional teacher. Hey, they promoted him immediately to drill sergeant. By the time he saw action, the next year, in 1814, Houston was a lieutenant. That was at Horseshoe Bend, a Native American stronghold. General Andrew Jackson had a combined force of regulars and militia, and they attacked. Regulars were assigned to hit the big barricade, and Major Lemuel Montgomery led the charge and was promptly killed. The next guy over was Houston. Houston caught an arrow in the upper left thigh, and he had a big old saber, and he held the guys off until his command caught up. And then he ordered a fellow to pull the arrow out because he wanted to keep up with the fight. The guy pulled it out, but boy, a hunk of tissue came with it. As the soldiers stormed the barricade, the fighting swirled into a heavily wooded peninsula. General Andrew Jackson rode by, saw Lieutenant Houston bandaged and seated, and ordered him to stay out of the fighting. But Houston tagged along anyway. And when General Jackson called for volunteers to assault a formidable log redoubt, nobody responded. So Houston borrowed a musket, and he limped forward thinking the men would follow his example. Nobody followed him. And Houston approached the redoubt, got about 5 yards away, and leveled his musket to fire a single round, and all of a sudden, here came a volley from the redoubt. And the loopholes just spit fire, and he was hit. Remember, he's already wounded, and he's hit in the right arm and in the right shoulder at the joint. And he went down, and he's thrice wounded now, and he'd like to die that night. The wound never did heal. There were a series of operations, and that was a day before ether, And that's when he started doing a lot of drinking. And he turned out to be a very talented carouser, as it turned out. And anyway, that thing had to be rebandaged every day the rest of his life. On the 5th anniversary of his enlistment in 1818, First Lieutenant Houston resigned his commission. He became a lawyer in Tennessee, but simultaneously he accepted appointment as Adjutant General of the Tennessee Militia. He was well liked by his fellow officers, and they elected him Major General and Commander. Houston was a 2-star general then at the age of 28. He was elected to Congress in 1823 and 25, to governor 2 years later in 27, and during this period, 1826, he shot and nearly killed a man in a duel. Dueling was illegal, but listen, the people of that frontier state, Tennessee, they admired a man who would take up for himself. Later, in 1832, he trounced a congressman, William Stanberry, who was almost as large a man as he was, on the streets of Washington, D.C. Stanberry had declined to fight Houston in a duel, but he started carrying a couple of pocket pistols with him just in case, and all of a sudden there's a chance encounter on the streets of D.C. Houston approached him, the guy pulled the pistol out, jammed it against his torso, and it misfired, luckily for Texas. But Houston again, was admired by frontiersmen everywhere, now including Texas. But in 1829, Governor Houston married Eliza Allen. She was 19 and he was 36. She was from a politically ambitious plantation family. And I think she was a little bit troubled in some ways too, and there were always rumors that she had a sweetheart anyway. And brother, that marriage was an immediate disaster. Eliza went home after a few weeks. There was a public furor, and Governor Houston felt honor-bound to resign. Now disgraced, Houston returned to the Cherokees, by now removed to Indian Territory. He licked his wounds out of a bottle. And instead of the Raven, Cherokees began to call him Big Drunk. He took a Cherokee wife, and they ran she ran a trading post that Houston acquired at Fort Gibson, which is beautifully reconstructed. Various tribes, however, began to ask his help with Indian agents, which he provided, and he began to lead travel delegations to Washington, D.C. And in 1832, he came to Texas, plunging into the Revolutionary movement. Here was the thing. When he got into all of that, there he was, a former governor of Tennessee, hero of Horseshoe Bend, Major General of Tennessee Militia, veteran of personal altercations, and now he had a Major General's commission from the Republic of Texas. These qualities triggered immediate respect among the citizen soldiers who served under him. Houston's imposing physique and his equally imposing background lent him instant credibility among volunteers. Few of the 1,400 and more men who served under Houston during that 6-week campaign of March and April 1836 had ever even been in an army. You look at a roster of the men who were at San Jacinto, and there were 40 some odd who had served as enlisted men in the U.S. Army. That's all. The rest of them, a little militia duty. But they were Texas farmers who volunteered to defend their homes and families, or they were adventurers from the U.S., and they were in Texas to acquire land. But here's the thing that some people have missed. They all were risking their lives. Everybody heard about Goliad and the Alamo, and they knew coming up against Santa Anna, they were risking their lives, and while most were competent riflemen, don't forget, they're coming from a hunting society, they were disorganized and they knew nothing of military maneuver. Sam Houston had spent half a decade as an officer in the regular U.S. Army, and he certainly knew how to teach close order drill and other basic movements. And his experience as commander of the Tennessee State Militia had taught him how to organize large numbers of backwoods volunteers on the east bank of the Colorado River at Burnham's Crossing as he withdrew his men, that strategic retreat I talked about. Houston went into camp for several days, introducing his growing army to close order drill. He later, at the plantation of Jared Gross, the wealthiest of the early colonists, Houston spent 2 weeks resting his exhausted army, letting a large number of sick men, a measles epidemic had hit his camp, and drilling his reorganized force. You see, it was one thing if Captain Houston, at the head of a company of 40 men, had given 20 of them to his lieutenant and said, you do this and I'll do that. That was one thing, but he well knew that hundreds and hundreds of men on a battlefield, there had to be some knowledge of what they were trying to do, how they were going to maneuver. Now, he had enough men soon to organize a second regiment of volunteer infantry, and Lieutenant Colonel Sidney Sherman was promoted to colonel to be in charge of that. And then there were more men, not enough for a third regiment, but enough for a battalion. And so the men griped and complained about retreating in the face of the enemy, about marching through the rain and mud on empty stomachs. And some of the officers talked openly about finding a new commander. Some spoke mutinous defiance, apparently within earshot of Houston, but Houston ignored them. He appeared not to hear taunts. He remained aloof from petty critics. He was the one who had been a professional soldier. He did not consult his officers. In fact, he wrote to his friend and supporter, Secretary of War Thomas J. Rusk, I consulted no one. I held no councils of war. If I err, the blame is mine. What a novel idea, a leader taking blame on himself. But Houston would not be hurried, and although some of his men continued to desert, mostly to be with their families, his army remained intact, despite their complaints, despite the criticism of some of their officers. The men continued to follow the directions of Houston. He had impressed them from the start, and his tight-lipped assurance in himself somehow added a touch of authority. Despite weeks of retreating through mud and rain, weeks of scant provisions, the core of the army did not lose confidence in their imposing general. Like Washington at Valley Forge, Houston kept his army together. Nobody but Washington could have done that during the Revolution. And I hold that nobody except Houston could have kept an army together under these even more challenging circumstances. Turned out in the end that Houston had never lost his grip on the ultimate purpose of an army, which is to fight. And finally, when Santa Anna placed his column with inferior numbers within reach, Houston pounced. He led over 1,000 men in an overnight march. Indeed, well over 100 of them dropped out. But they finally got down there at the water's edge in a stand of timber that was much larger back then, before the battleship Texas came in 1948, and they cleared a lot of it out. He concealed his men and their encampment. I didn't have any tents or anything. So they were concealed in there. Santa Anna could not tell how many men there were. There was a road that went right to left and right in front of them, or left to right, or north to south. And he had his men encamped there, and he made a speech. He had a booming voice, and he said, "Victory is certain. Trust in God and fear not, and remember the Alamo." Remember the Alamo. Houston had 2 6-pounders with him. He had gotten some artillery. The people of Cincinnati donated a pair of 6-pounders, little field guns, and somehow they caught up to us. How in the world? I guess the Lord was on our side for those things to come from Cincinnati and meet him on that winding retreat that he had done. They had on the 20th, today, on the 20th, there was an artillery duel between the twin sisters and Santa Anna's single artillery piece, a larger gun called the Golden Standard. There was also a cavalry skirmish impulsively led by Sidney Sherman, and it almost got Thomas J. Rusk killed. During the night, Santa Anna's men threw up a barricade, saddles, supply crates, brush in front of their camp in anticipation of a dawn attack. He hadn't attacked yet. Santa Anna figured he was coming at him in the morning, on the morning of April 21st. That was his thought. And so they stayed up all night, putting up that barricade. But Houston had stayed up most of that night planning an attack over unfamiliar terrain. He'd never been here before. And he went ahead and slept. He had his scouts tell him everything they knew, and he sort of made his plans, and then he went to sleep, and he slept till mid-morning. During that morning, General Martin Perfecto de Cos, he was responding to Santa Anna's order for reinforcements. He arrived with his column, perhaps 500 men. Now there were perhaps as many as 1,300 or more soldados in the Mexican camp. Houston had lost the numerical advantage. At last, there was a council of war. He agreed to one at noon on April 21. There was considerable talk about the officers about attacking the next morning on April 22. No. Houston had been riding his big horse, whom he christened Saracen, a great big light-colored stallion. He'd been riding it around camp, just feeling out the men, just wanted to see how they're acting. And what happened, like any good leader, Houston read the mood of his men, and he ordered an afternoon attack. They had been voting company by company to go on and fight now. He wanted his men to eat lunch, to fight on full stomachs, and to ready their weapons. Meanwhile, General Cos, his men had marched all night. Santa Anna's men also were exhausted from their nighttime labors with the barricade. Most of the camp fell into siesta. Now, they weren't lazy. They were just worn out from night-long labors. And Santa Anna must be blamed, or one of his underlings. Somebody should have set out vedettes, mounted patrols with an enemy camp nearby, but they didn't. They only had a few sentries here and there. Santa Anna also went into siesta. He retired to his marquee, big tent, and as legend would have it, to the attention of a mulatto prostitute that we nicknamed the Yellow Rose of Texas. Now, did that happen? I don't know, but gave us a really good ballad, the Yellow Rose of Texas. Can't beat that. General Houston began to form his units at mid-afternoon of April 21. The small cavalry force, he had 61 mounted men going into that battle. And they were on the right flank to cut off an escape route to the south. The twin sisters were in the middle. And he had infantry companies lined up in column like this. The twin sisters were right there, and then he had these companies here. It was a grassy plain out there, high grass, and there was a ridge out there that is gone now. And they just didn't see him. Maybe they weren't looking very hard, but here they came. When they got up about this far, now the monument is about not quite 2/3 of the way to the Mexican camp, which was up atop the hill. And when they got about this far, they fanned out into a battle line that was 900 yards wide. Houston, astride his big stallion, would lead from the front as he had at Horseshoe Bend. Within an hour, Houston led the long column forward. He rode back and forth across the front of his column to keep the advance even and to control fire. Of course, the visible presence of their general inspired the Texians. But Houston and Saracen made an obvious target, and he started hearing bullets thump into his horse. Thump, thump, thump. He was shot at least 7 times, they counted later, and finally the horse collapsed and died. Houston mounted an aide's horse and continued his dangerous patrol across the advancing front. Artillerymen muscled the twin sisters uphill through wet grass, and they got close enough to blast a path through that flimsy barricade. The Mexican cannon, the Golden Standard, was loaded but pointing downhill, and it fired too high. It was loaded with grape shot, didn't hit anybody. When Mexican sentries saw them and opened fire with their single-shot muskets, Texian riflemen began to shoot back. Houston shouted for a volley at close range, but again he went down with his horse. He quickly remounted as his left boot began to fill with blood. His ankle had been shattered by a copper ball. Mexican officers were forming up their men when at 20 yards, maybe 60 yards, pretty close range for these hunters. The Texians on the left, they fired a devastating volley that's under Sherman. And they were shooting for the braid. We had learned to do that during the Revolution, fighting the British. Shoot the guys with the fancy uniforms, and you'll get the officers. And we did the same thing in the War of 1812. Consequently, Brigadier General Castrillon was slain. 9 colonels were killed or wounded, 5 lieutenant colonels, 2 majors, 12 captains, 13 lieutenants, all killed or wounded and knocked out of the battle. General Santana emerged from his marquee and saw these officers going down. He got a horse and took off to the south. A wild charge ensued. The brave soldados now were leaderless. And all of a sudden, our guys are attacking and screaming, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad." Resistance ended within 18 minutes, but slaughter ensued. Houston and his officers frankly lost control of their men. Behind their camp was a marsh, a lake, and you can see it all back there now. There's a little bridge built out into it and everything now. And they just shot the guys down from the banks. There were guys saying, "Me no Alamo, me no Goliad," boom. They'd get their brains bashed in by a rifle butt or their throats cut with a Bowie knife. They counted 630 killed in action. Soldados, 630 dead, 9 Texans. 208 soldados wounded, 34 Texans including Houston. A total, counting the wounded, of 700 prisoners. It's a spectacular victory. All the next day, while Houston lay on a pallet, having his painful wound tended, prisoners were brought in. Late in the day, a bedraggled captive came in, and the men, the soldados, stood up so it said, "El Presidente! El Presidente!" The Texians clamored to lynch Santana, but Houston saw a much larger picture. He ordered Santana detained and guarded, and to save his life, the Napoleon of the West, as he had styled himself. He ordered all of his troops back to Mexico. He had 4,000 men still in Texas. They could have overwhelmed our guys. But he ordered all of his troops back to Mexico, signed a disastrous treaty recognizing the Republic of Texas as a nation and designating the Rio Grande As the southern boundary of Texas, it had never been there before. The badly wounded Houston was taken to New Orleans for better medical care. When he arrived, there was a crowd of 5,000 awaiting his boat. That included some schoolgirls from a little academy in Alabama. And one of the schoolgirls, was Margaret. And she would marry him in just a very few years, as it turned out. He had to have more than 20 bone fragments removed from his ankle. And remember, there's still no anesthesia. Ether wouldn't be invented till, I believe, 1844. But in New Orleans, he learned that he was celebrated as a hero. He learned that the spectacular victory at San Jacinto was a national cause celeb, and that he would be old Sam Jacinto the rest of his life. Let me close with an anecdote. Day after the battle, there was a large group of frightened refugee Texians, runaway scrape, and they had been headed south, hopefully away from the Mexicans, and they were trapped against Buffalo Bayou. They got to Harrisburg. Santa Anna had already been there a few days earlier, had burned the little town, and had burned a couple of boats they were planning to take. One of these desperate runaways, a Mrs. A.W. Terrell, she wrote an account of what happened late that afternoon. I'll quote her. Toward sunset, a woman on the outskirts of the camp began to clap her hands and shout, "Hallelujah! Hallelujah!" Those about her thought her mad. But following her wild gestures, they saw one of the Hardens from Liberty riding for life toward the camp, his horse covered with foam, and he was waving his hat and shouting, "San Jacinto, San Jacinto! The Mexicans are whipped and Santa Anna a prisoner." The scene that followed beggars description, she continued. People embraced, laughed, wept, and prayed, all in one breath. And as the moon rose over the vast flower-decked prairie, the soft southern wind carried peace to our tired hearts and grateful slumber. Back in 1836, there were perhaps 30,000 settlers here. Today, there are well over 30 million of us. We have the 8th largest economy in the world, larger than that of Russia. And here we are on the place that spectacular, momentous battle was fought 188 years ago. Perhaps in celebration, we too should laugh and embrace and weep and pray and shout hallelujah. Thank you for your kind attention.